Hi folks, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the idea of principlism in practical ethics, and to the four principles of biomedical ethics: autonomy, beneficence, nonmaleficence, and justice. These four principles are going to be a kind of guiding light for us this semester. They're going to come up again and again, both in the background of various things that we are discussing and as tools for framing the discussions that we're having. They'll prompt us to think about the moral issues that we encounter in particular ways, even if they don't lead us to particular conclusions or resolutions of those issues. So let's get started. Let's talk about principlism. There are a number of different ways of approaching a course in bioethics, or approaching the study of bioethics. Many courses begin, and many textbooks begin, by introducing you to the big three. The three big, overarching moral theories that are in popular use. These are a deontological Kantian theory. This deontological approach begins with the idea that we have particular moral duties, and that what we are required to do is ensure that our intentions are such that they fit with those duties. We ought to try to act in such a way that we fulfill those moral duties that we have. Those duties might be placed upon us by some god in a theological version of deontology, or more popularly, placed upon us by the idea of practical reason itself. Kant says that our moral obligations issue from practical reason itself. The second of these big overarching theories is consequentialism, or utilitarianism, usually associated with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. The consequentialist says, don't look at your intentions, but rather look at the outcomes. What matters is what actually happens, the consequences of one's actions. And we judge whether an act is good or bad, not based upon the intention of the actor, but based upon the consequences of their action. We judge it based upon whether it is the act that does the greatest good or brings about the greatest good for the greatest number. The third kind of theory that we often encounter, the third of this big three, is virtue ethics, or the Aristotelian and Platonic theory of ethics. Virtue ethics says we shouldn't focus either on the consequences of an action or on the duties that one has and the intention with which one acts, but rather we ought to focus on what habits one would have to develop in order to live a good life, in order to flourish. It's those habits, the habits of the virtuous person, that need to be developed or need to be molded in each individual. And the act that one ought to perform is the act that would follow from those habits, the act that the virtuous person would perform. Now, we often begin a class like this by introducing these three broad theories, spending some time talking about them and about the problems with each of them, and then we let loose on a bunch of moral problems and say, well, how would the deontological theory approach this problem? Well, how would the Aristotelian approach this problem? Well, what would Mill say about this particular issue? And we never come to any sort of real resolution because these theories are often in conflict with one another. These sorts of top-down approaches to moral theorizing begin with a big overarching theory that aims to be theoretically coherent. It aims to be internally coherent, and it aims to be in accord with the vast majority of our moral judgments. It aims to fit our intuitions. And then we are supposed to take this theory that is well justified and apply it to particular cases that we encounter, to a particular moral issue that arises in front of us. The problem is that these theories often lead us in conflicting directions. These theories don't agree with one another, and each of these theories faces certain problems of its own. There are times when it seems it is required of us to violate some moral duty that we have in order to bring about the greater good for the greater number. And it also seems that there are some times when we ought not to act in a way that brings about the greatest good for the greatest number if it means that we will violate the rights of a particular individual. So let's look at another way. Let's try coming at this problem from a different perspective. Rather than top up, rather than top down, we might begin with a kind of bottom-up approach to practical ethics. Rather than beginning with a broad theory and applying it to particular cases, we might begin with particular cases and use our intuitions and judgments about those cases as a guide. We might begin with what's often called casuistry. We'll begin with a particular case, take our intuitions as a guide in this particular case, and then examine nearby cases to see what our intuitions hang on, what's guiding our judgment in the particular case. Or we might begin with a kind of particularism or anti-theory about morality. We might say, well, we'll start with particular cases and argue it out with one another. What matters is that we can give good reasons backing the moral claims that we make or the moral judgments that we have. And what counts as a good reason is a reason that our interlocutor, the person we're talking to, will accept. And we work our way through moral problems by having debates about them. Both of these are kinds of bottom-up approaches to practical ethics. But we can see a problem in these as well. They seem to be unmoored from any moral principles that we might have. They seem to say that we have to figure it out on a case-by-case basis, and we have no guide in doing so. Rather, we're kind of left adrift to figure it out on our own. And this has seemed unappealing to some and also theoretically unsound to some. Principlism is a kind of bottom-up approach, but it aims for a kind of middle ground between high theory and casuistry. Rather than just focusing on each particular case, principlism says there are some broad moral principles that all three of these big theoretical approaches are roughly in agreement about, and more importantly, they're part of our common morality. There are these broad moral principles, or these broad moral commitments that seem to cut cross-culturally. They seem to be things that all people everywhere are in some way committed to. Now, sometimes they come into conflict, and we're going to have disagreements about which principle takes precedent in a particular case, and different cultures might give precedence to different principles. But in general, we all value these particular things, these particular ends, and we can use them as a guide as we approach the cases that are brought before us. We can use them to guide our reasoning, not in the way that a top-down approach does, not by saying, okay, here's this rule and we have to follow it, we have to figure out how to apply it to this case, but rather in the way of saying, well, here's this case, and these principles tell us to look for particular features this case might have, look at particular aspects of it, approach it from particular angles, and that might shed some light on what we ought to do in order to resolve this case, in order to bring about some kind of a resolution. So we're going to adopt this principlist stance. And this principlist stance really got its start in the late 1970s. Its early champions, Tom Beauchamp and Jim Childress, were professors at Georgetown University. Beauchamp is still a professor at Georgetown University, and these are sometimes called the Georgetown Principles. They both were working at the time, or Beauchamp was working at the time, on two projects. One was the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was a report that was commissioned in an examination of the research ethics that were violated in atrocities like the Tuskegee syphilis experiments or the Jewish home cancer experiments. And the Belmont Report developed a rubric or a set of principles that ought to guide our medical research, and those principles are still applied today. At the same time, Beauchamp and Childress were working on principles of biomedical ethics and doing a similar thing on the clinical side, trying to develop these principles that could help us reason about particular ethical conundrums that we encounter in the clinical setting. And Beauchamp and Childress proposed 4 principles. The first is respect for autonomy. The second is nonmaleficence. The third is beneficence. And the fourth is justice. We're going to take a look at each of these principles in turn. So let's begin with respect for autonomy. We all have some idea of what this word autonomy means. We've heard it uttered many times. We've probably used it ourselves. We've heard people say, don't interfere with my autonomy, respect my autonomy. You need to allow me to be an autonomous person or to make autonomous choices for myself. But what does it really mean to be autonomous? Well, the way we want to understand it for the purposes of this course is that autonomy is the capacity of an individual to make informed and voluntary decisions for themselves. That is, to make decisions for oneself and to follow through, to act on those decisions, without interference from external or controlling influences or forces. So nobody's coercing you, nobody's cajoling you, no one's lied to you or deceived you into acting in this way, no one's pushed you into acting in this way. With understanding, so you do this knowingly, right? You've reflected upon how you're going to act. You're not merely doing things on a whim, and we'll talk more about this next week, but not merely doing things on a whim, but actually have thought through your actions, and you're acting intentionally. It's not something you've done accidentally. It's not something you've just stumbled into or done reflexively. You intend to bring about a particular outcome, so you act intentionally. Autonomy is a central value in many moral systems, right? We think that individuals ought to be able to make decisions for themselves, ought not to have their lives ruled for them by others, but rather ought to be able to, in a rational way, choose for themselves. We see this requirement of autonomy, or this respect for autonomy, manifest in the requirement for informed consent in the medical context. Right? That a doctor will not perform a procedure on a patient until they've given informed consent. That is, until they've had the procedure fully explained to them, shown that they understand it, and then consented to the doctor doing the procedure. We also see the principle of autonomy manifested in the political sphere quite often, where we see that people want to be able to choose for themselves what sorts of risks they might take, rather than being told what acts are too risky or what sorts of activities are too risky and have to be avoided. A central question that we're going to wrestle with over the coming weeks is the question of exactly how we should understand the concept of autonomy, because the concept of autonomy is quite broad, and we need to narrow in on a particular conception of it. We need to figure out exactly how we ought to understand what is involved in autonomous decision-making. And how we understand what's involved in autonomous decision-making is going to determine for us whether we think that it's enough to merely respect autonomy, that is, to stay out of other people's way and let them make decisions for themselves, or whether autonomy is something that needs to be facilitated as well. That is, whether there are certain preconditions that are necessary for autonomous action that we need to ensure that we provide to individuals so that their autonomy can be not only respected but also supported. This is going to be a really difficult question that we're going to wrestle with over the first few weeks of this course. And I think it's really important to highlight at this point that autonomy is this really complex subject, not something to merely pass over and say, well, yeah, okay, I know what autonomy means. We need to spend some time digging into it, and we will. But for now, yeah, okay, I know what autonomy means. The second principle that Beauchamp and Childress propose is the principle of non-maleficence. A fun word to say. Non-maleficence is simply the idea of doing no harm, right? First, do no harm. Non-maleficence derives from, well, the word maleficence, right? Maleficent, evil, right? So do no evil. And the idea here is that healthcare providers enter into a relationship of care with their patients. This is a special relationship with special norms. They have special duties to the person they've entered into this relationship with, just as parents have special duties toward their children, or you have special duties toward your parents or toward your spouse or toward your loved ones. You enter into a relationship of care that generates these duties. One of them is non-maleficence. That is, that you have a duty to not intentionally harm or injure the patient. This includes harming or injuring the patients through negligence, through carelessness, or through the imposition of unreasonable risk. So non-maleficence requires of physicians or of medical practitioners more broadly that they be well trained, that they be attentive to their patients, that they not act carelessly or negligently, that they not impose significant risks on their patients, and in particular that they not intentionally harm or injure their patients. And so that is the principle of non-maleficence, which once again, once we hear it, is really broadly acceptable, right? This isn't something that we have to adopt a particular moral stance or moral theory in order to buy into. But there's a bit of a complication with non-maleficence because doctors do often, especially surgeons, do often prescribe courses of treatment that do significant harm to their patients. They cut open their patients. They prescribe medications that cause all sorts of awful side effects. They prescribe things like chemotherapy that cause a person to lose their hair or to lose their strength or to feel nauseous or worse. So how are we supposed to account for that if non-maleficence is this central principle that we adopt in bioethics? Well, here's where the doctrine of double effect comes in. The doctrine of double effect says that, many of our actions, probably most of our actions, have more than one consequence. They have more than one effect. And sometimes, in order to bring about the effect that we desire, we have to endure certain side effects. We have to endure certain secondary effects. We don't intend those secondary effects. We would rather avoid those secondary effects, but we have to live with them if we want to bring about the good effect that we're trying to achieve. The doctrine of double effect says that's okay. We can act in ways that unintentionally harm our patients, or healthcare providers can act in ways that unintentionally harm their patients, so long as those unintentional harms are foreseen but unintentional effects of actions that they are undertaking in order to bring about some good effect for their patient, some good outcome for their patient. So when we're making a judgment based on this doctrine of double effect, there are four things we need to consider. We need to consider the nature of the act itself. Is the act itself one that is not intrinsically evil or intrinsically injurious? As long as it is not, then it may be acceptable. We need to consider the agent's intentions. Does the agent intend to bring about the bad consequence, the bad side effect? Or does the agent intend to bring about the good effect, recognizing the bad effect as a foreseeable but unavoidable consequence of bringing about this good effect? As long as the agent's intention is pure, is aimed at the good outcome, then it may be acceptable. We need to consider the distinction between means and ends. So the means are the things that we do to bring about some outcome. The ends are the outcomes themselves. So long as the bad outcome isn't itself, or the harm isn't itself a means to some further end, isn't itself the intended means to bring about this end, but is rather an unintended consequence of trying to bring about this end, it's acceptable. So surgery, where you cut into a patient, the unintended consequence isn't the opening up of the patient. The unintended consequence is the pain and suffering that causes. But the pain and suffering isn't itself a means to the end of curing that patient. The opening up of the patient, the surgery itself, is the means to curing that patient. That means has two effects, the pain and suffering and the curative effect. And it is the fact that that means itself is not injurious. That means itself is not is not the injurious thing that matters here. So we need this distinction between means and ends. And then we also need to consider the proportionality between the good effect and the bad effect, between the curative outcome and the unfortunate side effect. So long as the good effect is better than the bad effect is bad, so long as the good effect outweighs the bad effect, it may be acceptable to undertake this act. So this is how we square this principle of non-maleficence with the fact that doctors do sometimes undertake actions that cause pain and suffering to their patients. They can do that so long as the act they take meets the test that the doctrine of double effect sets out. Let's turn back to the principles now. The third principle of bioethics is the principle of beneficence. So we've had do no harm. The principle of beneficence says do some good. Right? First, do no harm, then do some good. Work to the benefit of the patients that you have or of your patients and take positive steps to prevent harms to them. It's a duty to act in the patient's best interest. It's a duty to further the patient's best interest. This becomes paramount when a doctor is acting for or choosing for a patient who cannot make choices for themselves. When a patient is incapacitated in some way or unconscious and a doctor needs to make choices on their behalf or needs to make decisions on their behalf, they had better do it in the patient's best interest, not in their own best interest. It also becomes paramount when doctors are recommending particular procedures to a patient. They better recommend the procedures that are in the patient's best interest and not the procedures that they can bill the most for, or that would be the quickest for them to perform, or that the pharmaceutical rep is trying to encourage them to do. Right? So the principle of beneficence says we ought always to have the patient's best interests front and center. So it's not first do no harm and after that go nuts. It's first do no harm and then do some good. Now, it's sometimes held that that non-maleficence is a constant duty, that is one that ought never to harm another individual, whereas beneficence is a limited duty. Physicians have a duty to never do harm to anyone, whether it's their patient or not. Right? They shouldn't harm another patient or another person in order to better the outcomes for their patients. That would be wrong. That would be a violation of non-maleficence. But physicians don't have a standing duty to benefit everyone. They have a standing duty to benefit those with whom they've entered into this relationship of care with. They don't have to ensure that every patient in the hospital, including those who aren't their own patients, are getting the best possible care or are getting care that is in accord with their interests. And they certainly don't have to ensure that every person walking down the street is getting care that is in accord with their interests. So it is a kind of limited duty, or at least it's sometimes put that way. And the final principle that we arrive at, the principle of justice. Justice is a another one of these tricky topics to wrap our heads around, these tricky subjects to wrap our heads around, in part because we all have a concept of justice. We all have an idea of what we mean when we use this term justice. We all have an idea of what we are striving for when we strive to do justice. But what we need is a particular conception of it, a particular theoretical grounding for this idea of justice. We need to give it some content. We need to build in build on the meat to the skeleton of an idea. And there's a lot of controversy over exactly how to put the meat on this skeleton. There's a lot of controversy over exactly what we mean by justice. I'm not going to go into that in detail today, but I want to just sketch a very broad understanding of it. One way in which we might begin thinking about justice is to think about it in Aristotelian terms. Aristotle said that justice is giving to each that which is his due. We give to each person what is due to them, what is required to them. Now, what is due to someone is vague, right? Is it that everyone ought to receive an equal share? Is it that everyone ought to receive a share that is commensurate with the work that they've done? Is it that everyone ought to receive a share that is commensurate with their position in society? Is it that everyone ought to receive their share that is commensurate with their age? Right? Who knows? What's due to you is left to figure out here. But each person ought to receive their fair share. Now, we apply this concept of justice in a bunch of different realms. We apply this concept in the retributive realm, with the idea of retributive justice being that a wrongdoer ought to receive punishment that fits the crime. They ought to receive their fair share of the punishment, their fair share of retribution. We apply this in a procedural context. Procedural justice is just the idea that everyone ought to be treated as equal before the law. Everyone ought to be treated fairly before the law. They ought to receive their fair share of the procedural goods that exist to protect individuals before the law. And we encounter it in the distributive realm, and that's the one that's going to be of particular interest to us this semester. Distributive justice has to do with ensuring that each individual receives their due with respect to some scarce resource. It's about the distribution of scarce resources, whether that be the distribution of money, the distribution of food, the distribution of jobs or of offices within a society, or the distribution of scarce medical resources. Right? So the question of justice usually has to do with the distribution of scarce medical resources for us, the distribution of research dollars, the distribution of limited numbers of respirators or ventilators, or limited number of dialysis machines, or limited number of organs, or a limited number of public funding, or a limited amount of public funding that is available in order to remunerate the medical community for the procedures that they perform. Right? So questions about Medicare for all, questions about health insurance are questions of distributive justice in healthcare. And we're going to think broadly of justice as fairness. We're going to ask, what is a fair distribution of these resources? What's a distribution that fairly distributes the costs and benefits that are available or that need to be distributed in a healthcare system? And what is a distribution that balances individual rights and the common good? What is a distribution that balances the rights of individuals to make choices for themselves, to choose how to behave within a community, and the common good of that community? That's the question of justice that we're going to be wrestling with at various points throughout the semester. So that's it. Those are the 4 principles of biomedical ethics: respect for autonomy, nonmaleficence, beneficence, and justice. And these, as I said, will be our guiding lights over the course of the semester. So that's the lecture for this week. And we will pick back up next week by turning our attention to the 4 models of the doctor-patient relationship, where we will again apply some of these very principles that we've been talking about. So thank you.